For those of you who are here this morning, not to worry, our panelists and performers are actually here. I just wanted to welcome you back from coffee and tea. You're actually free to move about the cabin, so if you need to get coffee or tea during the course of the panel discussion to come, you're welcome to do so. My understanding is that we prefer that you not bring beverages into the hall, but with that in mind. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of our next panel, which is titled Urban Inventory, Composing Soundscapes of Modern China. My colleague, Professor Jennifer Iverson, is an assistant professor in the Department of Music here at the University of Chicago. She's a scholar of 20th century contemporary music with a special emphasis on electronic music, avant-gardism, sound studies, and disability studies. Her research explores the interaction between bodies, technologies, and sound, drawing together music analysis, archival research, and cultural history. This is when we were imagining a forum in which to think about sound, urbanity, the city, and the ways in which the city resonates in a contemporary and international context, a kind of dream panel, having Wang Lu and having an ensemble of extraordinary musicians and a group of colleagues to think about this is a rare and exciting opportunity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Iverson and the panelists to the stage.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Iverson. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really pleased to welcome you all to the University of Chicago and to engage you in this wonderful listening session before we get to hear a live performance of Urban Inventory. I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves, and then we'll continue our conversation.
Okay, I'm Julie Chu. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. And about a dozen years ago, I started taking interest in Chinese soundscapes, starting from a fascination with things like firecrackers and their ritual uses at a time like now, around the Lunar New Year. So I'm really excited to be in conversation with Wang Lu and Jennifer for this event.
Great. Good morning. My name is Wang Lu. I was born and raised in Xi'an, the ancient capital of China. And I'm a composer and professor at Brown University. I started composing when I was 14. I think ever since then, composition and writing music has been a really private and honest way for me to look inward to myself and to increasingly examine my relationship with the world, ever-changing world we're living today.
Fantastic. Let's sit and continue our conversation. Urban Inventory is a really fascinating piece that blends together recorded sound and instrumental sound made by acoustic instruments, as you'll see during the live performance. And what we thought we'd do today is listen to lots of excerpts from the piece and talk about what we're hearing and bring some of our varied perspectives from anthropology, from music composition, and from life in Chinese culture, really, into dialogue with some of these sound examples, with the hope that this will really prime you to have a very rich experience when we listen to the performance at about 11:50. So we'd like to start with a clip from the very first opening movement of the piece. So when I listen to this, I hear voices speaking kind of abstractly, babies crying, I hear the instruments producing the sound of like maybe leaves twittering, wind. Lou, what sort of soundscape are you creating here? How are you putting these materials together, and what are you trying to invoke in these opening seconds of the piece?
So the first movement of Urban Inventory City Park is written for pre-recorded tape and the live performance of 5 instruments. The tape was made by evening walks I usually take when I visit Xi'an, visit my family. We take those long walks in the park after dinner when all walks of life would come out and relax and exercise and sing and play their instruments. I find this soundscape in the park a really unique and heartwarming experience. So I started recording them by taking many walks and in the end, edit all the recordings into one as if it's one continuous walk. I'm trying to capture the noise, the complexity of layers, harmony inside, as well as the transient experience. And then I composed the instrumentation part to blend in with the ensemble, to give the effect to you, the listeners, as if you open the window, then you can hear through my experience a different soundscape, yeah.
Yeah, so what kinds of things happen in the park at night?
There are all kinds of activities. You see there are amateur Chinese flutists, there are exercise followed by radio broadcasting, there are Tai Chi, there are newly converted evangelicals singing hymn tunes, there are nostalgic revolutionary propaganda opera singers, and their children, and yeah, all sorts of things. And funny enough, I would walk often with my parents, and we wouldn't talk too much. We just enjoy this kind of intimacy. Yeah, enjoy each other's company, because also I'm the only child, and I don't see them that often. So the way of expressing emotion is probably not to keep saying I love you all the time, but just to spend time, experience this kind of life together.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You told me that the Xi'an City Park has a really visible city wall that dates from quite, long ago, Ming Dynasty, or perhaps older. And it got me to thinking about the ways that public space is often defined architecturally, right, by something like a city wall. But Julie, I'm wondering if you could also talk about the ways that public space might be delineated sonically. Even though sound is a much more porous medium, how is public space sonically defined?
Yeah, just so I think there are 2 ways I think about this. A sort of general way in terms of what a concept like soundscape offers, and then there's something China-specific we can talk about too. So I think people who often study soundscapes sometimes offer the concept of an earshot community. Right, so this sense that there's certain sound cues in the environment, much like landmarks, you can think of them as sound marks, so auditory cues in the environment that resonate and gather people within earshot, so within hearing distance of a sound. So you can think of something like church bells in a medieval parish that do the work of rhythmically organizing people through the day, in the way in which certain peals and tolls throughout the day mark off space-time and gather people together, or the sort of daily 5 Islamic prayer calls amplifying off a mosque, or in the Chinese context, something like the work of firecrackers that mark off ritual space-time. And so I think just listening to this particular track, we can think about these various evocations as sonic cues, as sound marks that might resonate with people, bring them together into a sense of sharedness, of resonance and simultaneity. So even if I'm not walking through the park, I remember living next to one of these environments where I hear a certain kind of music in the morning, and I think about the elderly doing their calisthenics, afternoon sounds of children playing, and so it can mark off time and certain senses of shared rhythm in that sense. The Chinese concept I would offer is one way of describing liveliness in a social space is a Chinese concept that is distinctly auditory, and that's the idea of 热闹, literally translated as heat and noise or hot noise. And so there's something particular and interesting about how Chinese have valued sociality, its liveliness, its welcoming, the kind of hospitable space of social density and gathering by indexing specifically the kind of tactile and affective dimensions of sound. So it's not just sound, it's sound as heat, insofar as noise as heat. So noise, which we conventionally think of as interruption, nuisance, disrupting a signal here, is in some ways being revalued as a hospitable sound that welcomes people into something like a social gathering in progress, bringing more bodies into contact and therefore generating that kind of heat that comes from people in dialogue, people in interaction. And so I think there's also something particular that's interesting in the Chinese context that in some ways infuses something like an essential auditory component in thinking, a concept like Emile Durkheim's collective effervescence in the social.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you talk about the way that the rhythm of everyday life is in many respects sonically organized. And to think about these shared sounds or shared reference points that bring us into a sense of heat or dialogue or a sense of cultural belonging. This came up for me when I encountered the second and third movements of Lu's piece, in which she quotes from The Red Detachment, one of the 8 model operas of the Cultural Revolution period. It's actually a ballet. And I thought we could look at a clip today from the ballet, from a production, and then see how Lu is using a quote of this material in her piece. And here's what Lu does with this quotation in her piece. Tell us about what you're doing here. Why does the red detachment appear in your piece at all? What's your relationship to this material? And then maybe in a second we'll get to hear how you're actually working.
I was waiting for the sound example. So the reason I chose this material is because I went to the People's Palace for an anniversary performance of Red Detachment with my family members who experienced Cultural Revolution. It was overwhelmingly moving. So you hear this first.
Please continue.
So we continue on this. I basically took the original material and distorted them to a overwhelmingly noisy and saturated degree, because I realized my parents lived through that period, was forced to listen to those recordings from the loudspeakers that had certain lo-fi sound qualities. And also, they were forced to listen to those music when they don't want to listen to. So when you actually turn the speakers off, the music will still stay in their ears, even after so many years in their retirements. They're still in their ears. So I also, for the instrumental part, wrote rather dissonant and harsh chords with particular orchestration to reinforce this intensified experience.
That's fascinating. Julie, in your work, how have you thought about broadcasting technology and distortion and these issues of sort of public broadcasting of shared cultural objects like this?
Well, one of the things I'm very fascinated by, which I'll be pursuing in my next project, is the kind of use of amplified sound in the kind of cross-strait conflict between Taiwan and mainland China. So one of the things I've been looking at is in the ways amplified sound can be weaponized, which happen at the sort of frontier zone where I work in the southeastern coast of China around Fujian and the outer islands of Taiwan, especially Jinmen Island. So one of the things they would do is amplify blast sound at each other through these radio towers, broadcasting sometimes very intimate message, encouraging soldiers from the other side to defect, sometimes even in the native local language as opposed to Mandarin, blast songs. So in fact, there was a kind of song battle that would happen, in some ways kind of pirate radio across the strait, in which on the PRC side, it would be music like this. It would be this kind of red song, sort of militarized, energetic music. And by the time you get to the late 70s on the Taiwan side, you have the kind of slickly produced, lilting, melodic sounds of Taiwanese pop, sort of iconically exemplified by Deng Lijun, sort of known as the sort of diva of Taiwan. And so that's the kind of thing that was happening. But as Lou was saying, I started doing oral histories and things around people in the era to think about what it was like during the Mao era, the soundscape. And one of the things that's clear in the PRC side is broadcasting the sound took place in sort of two overlapping networks. One is this compulsory PA system that Lou mentioned with these installed loudspeakers. Sometimes they're just little wooden boxes, speakers, put on the fronts of houses in which there's no volume control. And so every day, in fact, this earshot community, if we think of it that way, this sort of collectivized experience in which everyone's day would start with the East is Red being piped into public space. You'd have local broadcasting of news, sometimes in the native language as opposed to Mandarin, national broadcasts, and this would organize the rhythms in shared collective space. At the same time, there is this other sort of gray-black, vibrant market of personal transistor radios that I had worked with customs, and one of the things they noted in the Mao era is, in fact, one of the most prevalent contraband items besides your wristwatch and your sewing machine were transistor radios. So people had these memories of listening to the sort of compulsory sounds that came out of the kind of distorted loudspeakers in the front, and then they would go into their back rooms and tune in their little transistor radio to the kind of pirated signals across the strait to the Taiwanese pop. And so that sort of battle of sort of sound, in which, again, the kind of tenuous signal of the transistor radio with its own distortion, its own lo-fi qualities, becomes part of the nostalgia and the way that the over-amplified distortion in the public spaces that I think, Lou's trying to capture in the way she put together this composition, sort of work at cross purposes and intention in people's experiences of sound.
Yeah, you're doing a beautiful job of illuminating this movement between public and private space, especially as mediated through radio and broadcast sound. And I want to ask Lou a little bit of a follow-up question based on an earlier conversation that we had, because I feel like part of that negotiation between personal and public, or private and government, or shared culture, It comes with a bunch of different emotions, right? And you described some nostalgia for this music and some ambivalence about this music. I mean, certainly the distortion with which you're treating it in this piece sort of signals some of those conflicted emotions. But can you say more about how complicated it is to interact with these cultural objects that are on the one hand mandated and on the other hand sort of personally claimed?
Yes. So I was born in the 80s. I would not have lived through Cultural Revolution. But because this kind of music were the only kind of music my parents had experienced when they were teenagers. So they became our household music. On a Sunday morning, you wake up to music like this, and the different versions and a different range that you can sing in the karaoke. So in another word, you understand your parents' culture and the culture of the society in a very domestic and personal way. But also, you also question their relationship to this kind of music is by choice or not. It is something.
It's ambivalent, right?
It is ambivalent, yes.
Yeah. So we're going to go into more of the personal space for a moment, I think, as we transition to thinking about the fourth movement. I'm going to play for you the opening of the fourth movement, and I'd like you to attend in particular to the way the cello and violin duet are very speech-like. This is the fourth movement. Lou, what's going on here with the relationship between music and language?
Right. So this, I love this this artist. She's from the hometown, my mother's side, 老家 hometown, and she's a self-taught paper cut artist. And when she's making the paper cut, she would make up poetry to go along with her work. The beginning of the excerpt we heard was inspired by this speech. If I recite to you, then you can hear the kind of relationship. So it goes like this. 空空书，书空空，空空书里一窝蜂，蜂蛰我，我念蜂，蜂把我蛰得虚腾腾. So this poetry, the intonation and the linguistic contour and phrasing really informed the melodic writing and the orchestration of this particular movement. So I used the instrument with bending pitches and microtones and maybe excessive bow pressure, and etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the translation is very effective, hearing you speak that poetry after having heard the music, right, from the beginning of the movement. It's like a very close correspondence. Of course, Chinese being a tonal language affords this kind of mixing, right, between musical pitch and melody and the sound of spoken Chinese. Can you talk more about, like, is that something you work with frequently in your work, or is that just an effect you're producing here in a relatively isolated way?
I've been working with transliteration of language in some other pieces of mine as well. The initial interest started when I realized the local dialect of Shanxi dialect I speak with my grandparents is quite unique and dramatic. And then when we see our distant relatives coming from the village, they have a different intonation, even, more earthy than ours. And then I realized it is a symbol of social status when you open your mouth. The accent you have shows where you belong. So when I try to take inspiration from this language, I really have a close emotional relationship to people that's related to me, but in a different social economic class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talked a little bit about the contrast between the village and the city when we talked about this before, right? Your experience in Xi'an versus like going into the village and knowing that linguistic markers of dialect and pronunciation and all kinds of things like really mark out those urban and rural spaces, right?
Right.
Yeah, I guess I'm also curious because you told me that part of what's going on here is a recording of women gossiping with one another.
Right.
So in addition to these urban rural markers or dialects and the way they might mark out social class, there's also, of course, a lot of performative elements wrapped into language. And gossiping is a particular kind of linguistic communication that's different than like lecture or scolding and so on, right? So what's gossip got to do with it?
There's a little speech after the instrument played the transliteration of the poem. Then I was hoping by interviewing an aunt of mine who was a neighbor of this artist, she would be saying praisings about this artist, like she's wonderful, she's so talented, the work is amazing. But in fact, she said was something like, she doesn't know what she do. She went to Hong Kong, she just, she found this opportunity, they found her, and who knows, and, all this just not what I expected. And I find it really fascinating. And it's also makes me think the time I lived in China in the 80s and 90s, the time when a lot of peasants are transitioning into the urban life. And they're moving to the city to work and to contribute, and their view of their world and in relation to their culture has been really shifting. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to the fifth movement. I'll just disclose to you right off the bat that when I first listened to this piece, I thought that it included Chinese instruments as well as Western instruments. And I had only listened to a recording, and I asked Lou about this. And I was like, certainly you're using like the bamboo flute or the pipa or something, right? And she said, no, I'm really not. So I thought that was a fascinating moment for me at which I was still hearing some suggestions of Chinese instruments based on the way that you used the Western instruments, based on the way that you played them in low registers and plucked and all kinds of things. So I thought it might be interesting for us to listen to a piece that Lou composed several years ago when she was still living in China that does use Chinese instruments, and get the sound of those in our ear a little bit, and then go to a moment in the fifth movement when I thought I was hearing some of these things, and in fact it was just a sort of effect. So here's the piece, Qingdan, that was composed in 2003 by Lou with Chinese instruments. Okay, so that's the clip from the piece with Chinese instruments. Let's see if we can listen to a moment from the fifth movement.
因为这真的是一种功能。
Yeah, so are you hearing this with me? The suggestions of the bamboo flute, the suggestions of the lute. I think that's a fascinating aspect for me. But what we also have here is then mediated voices, right? And we have those sounds, again, of sort of radio broadcast sound, sound as heard through low fidelity, like audio broadcasting systems, right? Julie, how do you make sense of that mix of things going on? To me, it suggests listening along a historical axis. How do you think about it?
Yeah, I have some training in doc filmmaking where I remember when we had our audio recording exercises. So when you're aiming for realism and you're recording, it's all about the erasure of the act of recording and the media. So, the high fidelity is about this sense of immediacy that all this apparatus has to be erased from. And so there's something interesting about, when you use, that clean track, again, the sense it tries to create of immediacy, it takes all this other apparatus away. And then with every sort of introduction of noise, right, the distortion, again, you're not only thinking about the message anymore, that moment of connection that the signal is supposed to do. All of a sudden, with static, you think about the channel. And with a channel, you think about the network, and then the entire world in which a piece is produced, all of a sudden is in place in a different way. So in some ways, when you introduce things like distortion, the lo-fi versus the hi-fi, you're setting up a different sense of, space-time, the kind of immediacy of the moment of encounter with the clean cut, a little bit of static. When I hear the red detachment, for instance, I think about the broadcast signal from the television, right? Because of the very nature of how that sound is over-amplified, or the kind of low fuzz of the radio. That what's really great is it kind of worlds the sound, right? It brings that entire world in which the production, the gathering, the sharing comes into place with something like the quality of noise that gets introduced.
Yeah, Lou, how do you manage this? Or does it feel like a gap to you between these Chinese instruments that are very traditional in practice, in training, and these very modern sonic technologies like the radio? Like, how do you manage that gap in your own creative practice, in your own life? How has that presented?
So it's interesting, Jennifer made the connection. I actually never really thought this movement has anything to do with Chinese instruments before until she brought it up. But it does, hearing Julie talking does make me think about as an artist, our aesthetic choice is not coming from nowhere. So what I can say is I grew up listening to a lot of radio. Radio listening is also a bedtime ritual. I would listen to 小喇叭, the little piccolo trumpet broadcasting, often revolutionary heroes, sacrificial stories before I go to bed. And then I also heard a lot of pop music through radio. So that kind of sound quality is really embedded. So when I think about those sounds and hear those sounds, it's not just the melody, but also the quality, the nature, the characteristic sound bring to me. So,
Yeah, this is something that comes up in the last movement of the piece, right? Let's see if we can listen. I just love this moment when the pop music emerges from this landscape that's otherwise completely, high art, Western chamber music. It's such a sort of clash of high and low, right? Of Western and Eastern. So tell us more about what's going on here. This feels like, you mentioned bedtime listening, but this feels like a very personal moment to me, and I'm not quite sure why.
So in this movement, Yang Yuying is everyone knows from China, is a very popular mainland pop star. I took a song from her famous album, 我轻轻地告诉你, so Tell You Softly, and distorted the tape recording and composed a chamber ensemble part to go with it. I'm always very fascinated in the kind of sounds that has complexity in terms of cultural meanings. So this means what it means to me living in that time, but also what it means to distort it, to erase that kind of memory. Well, I was trying to capture this nostalgia and also just to inform myself moving forward with my future project. I still keep looking for sound with cultural complexities, and it's getting difficult because we live in a world that's increasingly globalized, and it's globalized capitalism. So just to go off the topic of this movement, so I was trying to research into textile factory because many of my close family members were laid off from the factory outside of the city. So I went in, tried to record, and tried to, hoping to find a soundscape that would evoke their shared communal life, of workers. But what I end up with is a very anonymous cacophony of machineries. Really makes me think, as an artist, what can I do? So in the end, I still decided to use those rather anonymous noise as my material and use a compositional skill and giving my personal and human touch to the material. So just as a comparison to this one, the material itself is full of life already. Yeah.
Yeah, embodied as it is by this beautiful pop star. Yeah. Yeah, so, it's very interesting to hear you talk about how in making compositions and making music, it feels to me like you're really navigating questions of identity and really navigating questions of the sort of sonic fragments that remain from your childhood and how they can be sort of translated, processed, reassembled into a coherent identity. Do you have thoughts about that?
I think we are the sum of sounds we perceive and we seek out to examine, but also not just a collection of things we heard, we store in our head. As an artist, for me, it's more important to process and to always position oneself in a shifting world. Because you live here and then you have a different perspective towards your own culture. For example, at the beginning of Urban Inventory, on the city park walk, I've took all my entire life, since when I was a child, the same park. And it only occurred to me, it's such a rich sonic experience after I've lived in America for many years. And then I listened differently, and I heard what I didn't hear before.
Yeah. Julie, do you have any thoughts about identity and how sound works, maybe on a cultural level or based on your fieldwork in the communities that you work with? How is sound a part of creating identity?
So, I go back to this notion of 热闹, which I think is so interesting as a way to, Chinese people use to describe what's inviting about a social space, about a social scene. This notion that sociality is about the heat of noise, which is so interesting, right? Insofar as we, again, I think we tend to think of something, noise, as, interrupts what might be the content or signal of a relay in communication. Yet what this points to is something like the kind of essential ambient architecture of social life, things that might either fall into the backdrop as background noise and then figure in the front as something that interrupts and calls your attention. So a fragment of sound that in a different environment might in fact turn from background noise into something we recognize as a sound mark, as a cue that all of a sudden brings people together into sort of shared listening. Anyone within earshot who listen to this at a particular time and place, listen to this music. Or I think of the early prefiguring of the people with their transistor radios listening to the contraband version of this, which would have been Deng Lijun in the late 70s or 80s. So that music evoking, all of a sudden you hear this fragment and it puts you in a time and place with anyone who shares, who remembers belonging to that kind of earshot community. And that's, I think what's really great about the kind of thing Lou's doing with these sound fragments and invoking, these possibilities of, shared community and identity.
Yeah, so in that sense, it's not just about Lou sort of assembling the sonic fragments of her life and these important sonic moments and recasting them. It's also about the way in which those sonic fragments are shared by others, right? And the recasting is something that is relatable based on a sort of cultural memory that's established through these sound markers, these shared objects, these shared experiences.
Yes, so I kind of think of it as, an invitation, insofar as, some of the noise interrupts and calls to attention as an invitation to join, this kind of, shared resonance in listening and thinking about, a space-time falls in place, when you sort of think and connect to the music at the same time. So that kind of possibility that opens up.
Absolutely. I think this conversation has really helped me understand what has so fascinated me about especially the interaction between recorded and acoustic sound in this composition, and the way that these fragments come in and out, are recontextualized, are, as you say, an invitation for us to hear together through different lenses. I think it's a really fascinating piece. I think we're in for a huge treat. We're going to depart and then welcome to the stage Ensemble Dal Niente, conducted by Michael Lewinsky. That was so wonderful. Thank you for the second round of applause. Aren't Ensemble Del Niente amazing? I'm joined, yay! And didn't Wang Lu make an amazing piece? Really remarkable. So I'm joined now by Michael Lewinsky, who is the conductor of Ensemble Del Niente, along again with Julie Chu and Wang Lu. And we'd love to hear your responses. We'd love to talk to you about what you heard, what you experienced. So please raise your hand. Yes.
Could you tell us about the notation and about how you arranged to have the soundscape integrated with the conducting? I mean, it's partly conducting, partly the instrumentalists.
So the question is about notation and how Lu integrated the recorded sound with the instrumentalists, how that's all put together in a score, how the conductor works with that.
How different it might sound the second time around.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know why Lu wants me to talk about this, but I will, because she wrote the piece and she's the one that had to figure it out. But it's a so the electronics are maybe less coordinated than in some pieces I've conducted. The first movement does have a click, actually, which would say that I'm following a metronome, trying to actually line things up with the electronics. But in the other movement, it's actually much more free, which is a really interesting approach and is actually a different approach than we often have, where the electronics are really very specifically timed to fit in with specific things that are happening in the music. And I think it actually works really well also for Lou's style of writing, which I think you can tell is kind of like, is carefully notated, but kind of sounds improvisatory sometimes. It sounds like free and suggestive and highly gestural. And I think, you know, in that sense, it's kind of a great instrumental analog to the sort of recorded sounds that she has. Does that answer your question?
Lou, do you want to add anything?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So the score is in the traditional notation with meter and rhythm and dynamic, and the electronics is triggered by the keyboard player also. And each sample has a different length, and Michael's talking about the first one is rather long, it's 2 minutes. So they're more or less lining up, but not precise to the exact second, because the harmonic progression in that movement is kind of slow. So you have a cloud of harmony that lasts for a few measures and longer. And then the next moment comes in. To me, it's more about the ensemble and the tape have the experience to generate this experience in the same cloud. It doesn't really matter this precise moment who arrived first, yeah. But they're more or less lined up, yeah.
There was another question right here in the front, and then we'll go here. Yes, please.
I felt kind of a
Oh, fantastic.
I felt kind of a connection to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Have you been influenced by any Russian composer, Stravinsky or otherwise?
What is your opinion on that?
What is my
Yes,
my opinion is yes.
yes.
And I'm also curious, you know, if you know, the cultural situations in, you know, Russia versus China, if there's, you know, if there's kind of like an arts similar arts response to the cultural evolution of Russia and China.
Yeah, thank you. I was trained at the Beijing Conservatory and before in the prep school in the Xi'an Conservatory. I realized our pedagogy largely was influenced by Russian pedagogy and French pedagogy at the conservatory. So as a composer, we were told to collect folk music and to work with folk traditions. We were told that we own the folk music from all 56 ethnic groups in China, although I'm a Han majority. So I did grow up singing a lot of folk music, and while I practiced piano diligently, Stravinsky's music I love, but also other composers. I think by choice or not, my training does have this emphasis rooted in your own culture and looking outwards and try to find a way to knit them together. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Lou. Let's have another question. Could we have a mic right here in the middle row?
So as you're composing and you're playing the score, are you sitting down and jotting down like each and every instrument, or how are you actually able to decipher where you're going to put each instrument? I mean, are you like stopping and you're like, you know what, I should put a little bit of flute here, a little bit of wind here, or, you know, how are you able to break that up like that?
So it's a question on the process of composition.
I mean, where you interject each, like the strings and the wind music and stuff like that. How are you able to sort of decipher that? You know, especially as you're listening to the score.
So for me, the process always starts with the idea, what this piece is about, and I could change the idea. And then it starts with a structural, and then usually a strong harmonic consideration, where the harmony is moving. And then with the gesture, what kind of texture, right? And the instrumentation apply. And then detail to, at this moment, I want something very soft and project to a bigger space and has some air sound. Maybe I would give it to a bass flute in this particular register, or maybe I give it to a cello with softer and playing on the fingerboard, doubled by flute or clarinet in this register, then not down to the detailed decision, but usually it's coming from a larger scale down to scrutinies, yeah.
What other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. That was really fantastic. I think I'm in a different position than many people in the audience because I'd heard a recording of this on your CD before. And what really struck me, both when you were playing the clips and my memories of that CD, is how different the experience is seeing it performed as opposed to just hearing it. Because when I'm hearing it, especially without the sort of brilliant elucidation of what you were doing in the introduction, the textures of everything merge together. You don't always hear where the noise begins and ends and where the instrumentation comes in, and your style has really blurred them. But when you're watching it, it's completely clear. And so I wondered if that entered into your thinking, or do you have a preference for the live or the recorded? The recorded one also erases all of the differences in some ways of the temporal differences are both highlighted and erased.
Right. Thank you, Julie. That's a great question, because this piece, imagine the first moment in the recording, you hear everything mixed and mastered coming from the same speaker or headphone, the acoustic and pre-recorded, it's all on the same level. But here you have a pre-recorded coming from those two speakers and live performance acoustic from that direction. It really creates a layer. And also, she's asking, when I compose, actually, whether it has an electronic part or not, I do imagine the choreography of musicians on stage. I would imagine if you write an interval from a C to a B above, would this instrumentalist move in what kind of gesture? And for coordination as well, I think about, do they have to cue each other, and do they look excited to play, or do they look like they really have to nod their head to count? Those are the choreography is really impacting how I compose as well.
Yeah, Judith, I also noticed the same thing. And I know we talked a little bit about this ahead of time, but the difference between recorded sound and live performance was astonishing, I thought. I especially noticed it at the moment of the red detachment quote, where the sound was cacophonous and completely overwhelming, and the instrumentalists were sort of playing with everything they had to get through it. And I know you've also studied a recording of this piece, of course, in preparing it. So have you in preparing for this. So I wanted to ask you guys about your experience hearing it live or conducting it from the best seat in the house, versus studying it on recording. Does anyone want to speak to that?
Sure. I'm happy to say a few things. Sure. I think I think that's a really interesting comment. Thank you for that. And to me, it really feels like when I'm conducting it in real time, it feels less like a unified kind of single thing and more like the instrumentalists are commenting, as it were, on the recorded material. It actually feels like the relationship between the recorded material and the instruments feels very different when it's actually in performance, where it feels like, there is kind of a question of legibility. It's sort of like, what do these sounds mean? And when you hear it on a recording, it seems like a unified whole, and when you hear it live, it really feels like it's an interplay between the recorded sounds and the instruments really do have a kind of more active role. Like, I think actually, I would even say something, I'd go far as to say that we actually play it rather differently than the recording. I think partially as a result of just the acoustic of the room, but also just the kind of like energy of responding to the recording, I think actually just changes subtle things about the interpretation. Like, I think we actually probably play, I think the performance we just gave was actually louder than the recording is. And I would say the dynamic levels of the instruments, they just played a little louder because it felt like they had to kind of appropriately, not compete with, but sort of respond to the recorded sound. So that's my impression, just sort of, that's my off the top of my head impression.
I would just say I really love hearing Lou describe composition as choreography, which is so interesting, because I think what it enhanced for me watching the performance is this notion of sound as movement, right? Insofar as we think about, the sort of air pressure through the air, vibrational force, and also the kind of collaboration of movements that gets put together in a way that I think a uniform sound mix does, so the discretion of those parts and how they coalesce, doesn't come out as clearly as a live performance. So that was neat to just see that happen.
Thank you all for being here and for offering your wonderful thoughts and questions as a response to Lou's piece. It's now our lunchtime, so we're going to break for lunch, which will be out in the Gidwitz lobby, and then we'll reconvene here at 1:35 for a conversation with Mel Chin, Oriana Caccione, and Jeff Oppenheimer. So please come back at 1:35. Thank you very much.